America 2, video number 3F. Welcome back to the final video in the America 2 video series relating to problem number 1 that's adversely affecting not only our country but the whole world. Problem 1, all 6 videos, has been dealing with excess population. My name is still John Shaw, and I'll again be your host for this video. We'll pick up where we left off in the last video relating to problem number 1 with Symptom 21, engaging in expensive wars for territory and resources where supposedly for national security purposes where the only real winners are the government and the commercial interests. Since December 7th, 1941, America has been involved every single day in a shooting war somewhere in the world. During the Great Depression of the 30s and 40s, our government created government agencies designed to get unemployed and starving people back to work. And most of these programs were also designed to improve or expand the nation's infrastructure as a byproduct. A lot of streets got paved. Some highways got built across the country. Some dams got built. And a link to the bread lines and the streets of cities and towns all across the country were made shorter, temporarily. When the Great Depression started in 1930, there were approximately 110 million people living in America. By 1937, the population had grown to almost 120 million. Our population grew by about 9% in the worst 7 years of the nation's history, up to the present time. The population growth between 1930 and 1937 could in no way be construed as making things better. In fact, even with government taxes and government spending over that period being the greatest per capita they had ever been in our nation's history, the unemployment rate and the poverty level throughout the country were essentially the same at the end of 1937 as they were at the start of 1930. Government spending and make-work jobs were not enough to improve the economy and even reduce, let alone eliminate, poverty and joblessness, or even make things measurably, permanently better, while the population needing subsistence continued to grow. Finally, in 1941, America was able to join in a war that was destroying Europe and that was big enough in scope to get our entire workforce back to work at meaningful work. And the Great Depression was declared to be officially over. Public elation was so high when the war ended that people really didn't much notice that aside from the significantly increased income taxes and the borrowed money being spent to bulk up our military and to pay for all the new welfare programs that had come online during the Great Depression, America's economy was really still in the toilet. Income taxes rose to the 90+% level for the top personal and business tax bracket, and some companies began moving parts of their manufacturing and assembly operations to other countries to lower their tax burdens. The number of job migrations to other countries was small at the beginning, but people were already starting to question, why is this happening? America was generally acknowledged to be the best place to be. Why then were they moving their operations to other countries? The government didn't have answers to the questions they were being asked by the citizens, but luckily for them, the government, the politicians were able to get America involved in another war of significant size in Korea for about 5 years to again rejuvenate the overall economy and quiet public unrest a bit. Public unrest regarding income tax levels stayed stubbornly high in people's minds until the government decided in the 1960s to lower taxes significantly or risk a tax revolt, or worse, possibly a real revolution. Concurrent with all of this, we went through a 10 to 15 year period known as the baby boom, and our population growth accelerated even more rapidly than before. The only lesson the politicians seemed to take away from all of this was, hey, war is good for business and the economy. Well, none of this was free. National debt rose from $16 billion in 1930 to $271 billion following the Great Depression and the end of World War II in 1946. It depends, I guess, on how you view it. In one sense, it only grew by $254 billion. Looking at it another way, the debt grew by 1,600% over a 16-year period of time, roughly 100% a year. Considering the fact that it took us as a country almost 150 years to grow the debt to $16 billion, and it only took us 16 years to grow it 16 times that amount, I think we can conclude that wars, while perhaps good for business, are also very expensive. And the increases in expenses have to come from somewhere, and the profits accruing from those expenses also have to go to someone. Nowadays, since less than half of the citizens with income have to pay income taxes, the remaining, a bit less than one half of the citizens, have to pay at least twice as much as they would have had to pay in it if everybody had to pay taxes. But, according to the government's point of view, things are right now just about perfect. So there is no driving need to put the 50 million to 100 million people who are either unemployed, underemployed, or idle immigrants to work at meaningful paying jobs rebuilding our economy to pre-Vietnam War levels with monetary inflation taken into account. The government sees population growth as a very positive thing. After all, it keeps commercial enterprises from Kentucky Fried Chicken to Amazon shoppers and sports enthusiasts increasing in number. And that, in turn, is good for business and the economy. Right? The fact that more jobs are being eliminated or downgraded in pay that are being created at meaningful pay levels directly, negatively impacts poverty levels. And it requires most citizens to remain in debt all their lives to banks, to government, and finance companies in order to support the government's desired population growth. And that population growth is therefore of little interest to the politicians. And the fact that the graying of America's population continues to require ever greater amounts of money to take care of an aging demographic is also of little interest to the politicians, because they, after all, have these things covered for life, as do their families. But these things should, however, all be of great interest to the rest of us. The sole requirement for any nation, regardless of its population. To maintain a viable economy is for the nation to find a way to provide enough good-paying jobs to its workforce so that the welfare-type government programs never become a preferred way of building the economy. Symptom 22. Expensive diversionary wars against non-combatants, mostly nouns, with no identifiable enemy to face, like poverty, ignorance, terror, drugs, illegal immigration, abortions, guns, race bias, gender bias, and so on. The government is the great creator of financial band-aids. First, the government causes the economy to be continually weakened. Then, they propose to come in riding like a knight in shining armor to save the day. Each of the needs identified in the opening paragraph has been made greater every year by America's excessive population growth. In fact, it is not possible to find such a need that didn't arise out of America's working population being decimated by our government to curry favor with the financial interests that ultimately decide who will lead us in our government. First, the government worked to destroy over 40 million jobs, and then they refused to invest in creating equal-paying jobs to replace them. And America has been struggling more as each year goes by to live under the fatally flawed economic model our government has created. A few questions regarding these needs identified by our politicians as problems to be solved by way of going to war against them. If any of the needs categories in this symptom, fighting expensive diversionary wars, shown at the outset of this topic were, in fact, things we could go to war against, get a signed declaration of surrender from, and when the war was over, assuming we won the war, how do we know who the generals are and who the foot soldiers are? None of them have uniforms with insignias. None of them are organized even loosely into platoons, squads, regiments, or divisions. None of them have soldiers carrying weapons of the same kind so as to be usable by another soldier when one soldier is killed. None of them have fleets of vehicles suitable for carrying them into combat. None have an air force or a navy. None of them have weapons of mass destruction that we know of. And none of them have a flag they march under, and so on. Give me just a second here. Thanks. Does the government even know who on the other side is leading the charge? How does anyone in our government know how much funding will be required to be victorious? Hopefully our politicians are not so foolish and naive that they only seek enough in the way of resources to keep from losing. Shouldn't our strategy be to win the war, not just hold it at bay and drag it out? And in order to know if our selected strategy is working or not, should there not be a timeline showing which each objective should be met and the cost of achieving that goal, that the citizens can review and decide amongst us all if we're even going in the right direction? Hopefully our politicians are not so foolish as to think that these kind of things can be handled by just shooting from the hip at budget preparation time. Of course not. That is what we have bureaucracies and bureaucrats for. Creating bureaucracies has four positive effects for the politicians. 1. It allows them to kick the can kick the can down the road and make it someone else's problem from that point on. 2. It gives them something to brag about on the campaign trail. Look, I made a positive difference by creating a department to handle a problem. 3. It allows them to avoid taking blame if something doesn't work out as planned. The blame gets spread over all 535 members of Congress. And 4, perhaps most importantly, it keeps people focused on relatively unimportant things, while the politicians continue their efforts to run the country mostly for the benefit of the ones paying for their campaigns. It is the citizens' tax money that's being spent towards these ends. So shouldn't the government be held accountable for winning these wars in a timely manner? The various needs outlined at the beginning are, for the most part, real and definitely need attention, and lots of it. But the kind of attention they're presently getting is not the kind of attention they should be getting. The government's approach is to continue putting band-aids on these symptoms of a society in decline. The proper and most workable approach is for government to actively work to recreate the tens of millions of jobs that they destroyed to appease the commercial interest, and in doing so, eliminate the needs entirely, for the most part. The poor and the sick will always be with us. That is a given. To what degree they'll always be with us is not a given. The matter of degree to which they will always be with us is entirely up to us and what we decide to do to bring the degree level down to the lowest possible point. The more our population is brought into balance with the number of citizens needing meaningful paying jobs, the sooner each of these needs can be brought into line with what our increased working population with meaningful paying jobs will be called on and can afford to pay and to take care of them. We're all familiar with the old saying, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, he'll feed himself for life. If we were to change the wording just a little to give a man a welfare check and you feed him for a month. Give a man a meaningful paying job, he'll feed himself and his family for life. The secret to having a vibrant economy is to create as many good paying jobs as there are qualified citizens needing them. It will be essential to match the population needing good jobs with the number of good jobs created to employ them. It is a classic supply-demand situation. Symptom 23. Loss of individual rights to privacy. Ever-growing population worldwide, spooking the herds worldwide. We don't like to think of it ourselves as such, but humans are, to an extent, herd creatures, just like sheep and cows, even many fish and birds. And in herds, when one animal is spooked, for whatever the reason, and starts to run, it can cause a stampede. And sometimes, the larger the herd, the easier it is for one animal to cause the whole herd to panic. Witness what happened in Germany in the 1930s. Governments in general see it as one of their functions to control, not eliminate, just control, panic in their societies. Sometimes government goes overboard and implements programs that create problems and panics just as big as the problem they set out to solve, sometimes bigger. Beginning with 9/11, the government established programs to deter terrorist attacks by implementing surveillance programs that violated the rights to privacy of every citizen, in hopes of identifying a handful of citizens who wanted to damage America for whatever the reason. The government's approach to solving the security issue now has resulted in government listening into every phone conversation made by anyone in America and building walls between us and our southern neighbor country of Mexico. These national security activities have resulted in spending hundreds of billions of dollars annually, much of which we have to borrow from other countries to pay for each year, with no end in sight. Our government is now spending as much or more annually on national security as was spent fighting World War II or the Cold War in the 60s and 70s in their entirety. While, by the government's own figures, more than 21% of our entire population, about 75 million citizens, are still living below the poverty level. Nobody is asking those living below the poverty level, but it's possible, maybe even probable, that a sizable number of those living in poverty now would gladly sacrifice some security in exchange for decent housing, better food to eat, better medical treatment, and better education for their children every day of their lives. People are now almost as afraid of what they say being overheard and misconstrued and having to defend themselves in court because of their overheard statements between one another as they are afraid of a terrorist threat harming them and their families. Wow. Big Brother is watching. That phrase came from a book entitled 1984, written by George Orwell in 1949. In it, Orwell predicted that our government would find excuses to us, reasons to them, for gathering more and more information about each of us, and then use that information to control every aspect of our lives. Homeland security has now become America's big brother. Orwell was alarmed at the ease with which government could upend individuals' lives with no credible evidence whatsoever of any wrongdoing, simply by making unfounded accusations and creating suspicions, and in so doing, introducing fear into the population overall. At the time, in 1949, Orwell wrote his book, 1984. We had just concluded World War II, and were entering another one in Korea. Our government enlisted the citizens to help in stopping the threat of takeover of all the world's democracies by communism. The communism threat, in turn, was a carryover from the World War we were engaged in as allies with Russia and China in 1945, both of which countries we saved from fascism during World War II, and both of which countries in 1949 were still dedicated to communism, as they had been even before World War II broke out. Currently, in America, there are possibly 1,000 people plotting to do harm to our country. The 1,000 figure is just a ballpark figure pulled out of the blue by me. The actual number could be 10% of that or 10 times that. In any event, even in the worst case number expressed as a percentage of our total population would be statistically insignificant. 10,000 divided by 360 million equals 0.00002%, or 2/100,000ths of 1%. Whatever the actual threat percent, if our intelligence organizations are worth what we're paying them each year, they already know who at least 90% of the would-be terrorists are, and have someone watching them every day. So that 90% should logically be no threat anymore, whether the terrorists know it or not. That leaves possibly somewhere between 10 and 1,000 people out there that our intelligence communities might not know about yet. And some of those 10 to 1,000 people may well be dangerous, possibly very dangerous. How our nation's growing population responds to a potential threat like that tells the whole world who and what we are as a society. Our government spends hundreds of billions of dollars every year looking for ways to keep all the citizens safe from terrorists. That's probably a worthwhile use of taxpayer dollars. Some of the money spent doing this could also go a long way towards paying for a national health care program for America, one covering all citizens. That might also be a worthwhile use of taxpayer dollars. It may well be counterproductive, letting somewhere between 273 and 535 members of Congress, 0.0000015, a little over 1/1,000,000th of 1% of the nation's population, make all the decisions as to how much money to spend on one and how much money to spend for the other, and possibly how much to spend on some other things too. The government does not know the scope of the problem or have any idea how much it would cost to achieve a goal of 100% security for all citizens. The other thing that the politicians don't know is what percentage of the citizens would actually be willing to trade privacy for security, or how the citizens might decide to divide up the money down being spent solely for national security. This is a decision that would likely better be made by every citizen voting in a national referendum on the question. After all, if a citizen wants to have perfect security, all that is required is that the citizen commit a serious criminal act and be sentenced to live out the rest of his or her life in a maximum security prison. There is literally no safer place on earth than being locked locked up in a maximum security prison. Government too frequently uses mass hysteria as a basis for implementing programs that end up inducing F for fear, U for uncertainty, and D for doubt, the FUD factor, F-U-D factor, into the citizens' thinking. 9/11, Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, or a threat by some foreign power to nuke us all back to the Stone Age, and so on. The bigger the population, the bigger the threat in the government's view, and the greater the reason to spend more deterring the threat. The government does these things, in part, because people who are F, fearful, U, uncertain, and D, doubtful, are more easily led to do the government's bidding. How American citizens choose to go in answering the security versus privacy question will ultimately tell the world if America is still the land of the free and the home of the brave. Symptom 24. Fears of terrorist attacks and nuclear wars. Population levels play a significant part in spreading fear of terrorist activities and attempts to deter them. The greater the population, the more people there are that will consider creating freedom for security, and the greater will be the government's tendency to spend money increasing security at the expense of citizens' freedoms and rights. It has always been so. Mathematically, it becomes a simple matter of proportions. The bigger the population, the more people will be willing to sacrifice freedom for security. It's happened dozens of times all over the world for centuries. Millions and millions and millions of people giving up their ability to defend themselves and willingly sacrificing their freedom to gain the security of a government that changes hands and policies frequently. Many of America's citizens are here now because of the way these arrangements ultimately resulted in tyranny enveloping their countries, including, in the past, our founding fathers. Americans have been directly or indirectly involved in both terrorist attacks on our country and its citizens and nuclear warfare. America was the first to deploy nuclear weapons in 1945 when we bombed Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan. The arguments still go on today regarding whether this was the best way to end our war with Japan, because it's now generally conceded that we would have won either way. Shakespeare reminded us that the past is prologue. That saying, in effect, says we could never go back and undo things we wish we might have done differently. We can only go forward because that is the only option open to any of us, individually or all of us collectively. America was not the only nation working on nuclear fission at the time. Both Germany and Italy were looking in that direction, and in fact, it was an Italian, Enrico Fermi, that demonstrated in 1934 that nuclear fission was possible when he succeeded in splitting a single atom into its separate components, protons, neutrons, and electrons. All of which is to say that if America hadn't been the first with the bomb, some other country would have developed it anyway. And now, because the past is indeed prologue, we're stuck with trying to find a way to put the genie back in the bottle, when doing that is an impossibility. And that brings us to the threat of terrorism, which has lasted every day, has existed every day, since we built the first nuclear bomb, and has now been augmented by the introduction of some new and improved chemical and bacterial weapons. Chemical and bacterial weapons can be deployed without needing a sophisticated airplane or rocket, and have already been deployed that way more than once, beginning with World War I. 9/11 showed the world that a handful of well-financed and highly motivated fanatics can inflict great damage anywhere in the world, given the proper opportunity in totally unexpected ways. And for some, maybe even most of us, that knowledge influences our thinking and induces fear. Mostly fear that we may be powerless to defend ourselves against such threats when and if they arise, since the actions taken by the terrorists are typically not based on reason, but instead are mostly based on emotion and religious fanaticism, and are therefore difficult, if not impossible, to predict with any degree of certainty. Bottom line, no matter how much money is spent, all such acts will not be prevented. In a sense, terrorism can be looked on as an actuarial problem. That is, how much money should be spent trying to hold occurrences down to a level we can live with, like how insurance companies decide how much they need to charge in premiums to be able to pay claims for or against their insured drivers. The insurance company doesn't expect the traffic police to stop all fatal accidents, but accepts the fact that some level of fatal accidents will happen no matter what we try to do to prevent them. And Big Brother watching everyone every day won't keep all terrorist activities from happening, any more than doubling or tripling the numbers of police on the streets will keep all robberies, murders, and traffic fatalities from happening. We can make things better, hopefully much better. We cannot, in all probability, make things perfect. The bigger our population grows, the bigger these types of threats at both the local and national levels will grow proportionally, and the more will be the cost to hold them down to a level we can live with. Possibly the best way, or at least one of the best ways, to put these fears into a proper perspective is to rebuild our economy. Make sure that every qualified citizen that needs a good job has a good job, and that together we can afford to pay enough in taxes to finance the necessary protective services of our government and still have enough left over to finance a good life for us and our families without going into never-ending debt personally or as a nation, and without sacrificing our privacy as part of the price. And once again, we've come full circle, back to the negative effects of a population out of balance with the worker supply-demand element of our national economy, and how it affects every aspect of our daily lives, including how we view terrorist threats and decide how to respond to them. Symptom number 25. Eminent domain laws that result in the loss of personal real property to the government for later sale to the commercial interests for pennies on the dollar, to curry favor with a potential new tax source for the government. As the population increases out of proportion to the number of citizens contributing to the government coffers by way of paying taxes, the government is forced to find other sources of money to meet its spending needs. To replace the money lost by way of a shrinking number of people per capita working at good jobs and paying money into the government sometimes takes privately owned land for its uses that belongs to a citizen or citizens who don't want to sell the property and don't want or need the government's money. But the government then uses an eminent domain law to have the courts take it from the citizens to do with as the government pleases. The government pays the court specified amount deemed fair to the court, not necessarily to the citizen whose property is being taken, and the government is therefore free to use, rent, or dispose of the newly acquired property as it sees fit. The government's reasons for taking the land in this manner is deemed converting the land to a higher and better use. In any number of instances, the government has acquired property simply for the purpose of increasing income to the government. When the property is then rented out or sold to another party who will possibly also then pay things like property taxes, use taxes, and income taxes back to the government as a result of the transfer. The government, most especially the courts, have deemed these transfers to be in the best interest of the country and claim to have done so by converting the property in question to a higher and better use. If the country's worker supply-demand relationship was in balance with the nation's population growth overall, such occurrences should never need to occur. Symptoms number 26. The U.S. government's need to always be involved in at least one shooting war somewhere in the world at all times, in order to put citizens to work here in America, mostly working for the defense contractors and the downstream suppliers. Simply put, war is good for business. And our government sees wars as the quickest, if not the cheapest way to jumpstart a dormant economy. As our population continues to grow, beyond the number of good jobs available to employ our out-of-work and underemployed citizens, the workers' supply-demand equation thus being out of balance, our government seeks new ways to get people back to work. And one of the preferred ways they've hit on is to keep us engaged in military conflict somewhere around the planet at all times. Now, sometimes the war is legitimate and must be fought to save the country overall. Other times, the reasons are contrived, and we go to war anyway. Our government has dedicated internal divisions of two intelligence organizations, the CIA and the NSA, whose primary purpose is to destabilize governments around the world and push them and their country into civil wars. Once the Civil War gets underway, America's government enters the fray, initially by sending money to support one side in the conflict. The amount of money we initially provide to one side in these conflicts is typically not enough to bring the conflict to an end, and more money is almost always needed. Later, we may send war supplies, and in some instances, troops. To get our citizens to approve these ongoing expenditures of taxpayer dollars, our government must then create a reason for sending more taxpayer money on an ongoing basis. The reasons given by the government are often not the real reasons, but instead are reasons that they can get the citizens to accept and go along with. A recent example of this would be the war in Iraq in 2003, where government leaders insisted that the Iraqi government was developing and stockpiling both nuclear and chemical weapons that they intended to use against America. Now, Iraq had previously developed and used chemical and biological weapons in the 80s and 90s against other nearby Islamic populations. After the first Gulf War in 1991, most of Iraq's chemical weapons were destroyed, but total disarmament of these types of weapons was never 100% confirmed, and suspicions remain in some quarters within our government that Iraq might still have some weapons stashed somewhere that they could use. Iraq had also, in the early 1990s, started a program to develop a nuclear capability, but it was confirmed that they never succeeded in developing a nuclear weapon. But the suspicions remained that they wanted to do so, and were possibly working towards these ends in secret somewhere in Iraq. The government used this combination of questionable facts and suspicions to convince America's citizens that we should go to war against Iraq to preclude their ability to mount an attack on America. Preventative war, so to speak. Prior to our actually invading Iraq, significant numbers of inspectors sent by the United Nations looked all over Iraq for months preceding the actual invasion by our troops, but found nothing and concluded that Iraq might well want to destroy America with weapons of mass destruction, but such an attack was unlikely, if not impossible. Iraq just didn't have a combination of know-how, tools, manpower, and money sufficient to accomplish such a task. And based solely on the available lack of supportable facts, no other nation of consequence would join us in the invasion, but our government invaded anyway, in the process killing thousands of Iraqis and some of our soldiers as well. Then, 26 days later, 26, I said that, you heard it right, 26 days later, declared the war to be over. Mission accomplished, and told our citizens that we had won a decisive victory. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. Even after 20 plus years of ongoing searches after the shock and awe war of 2003 in Iraq ended. Costs of the war were never pinned down exactly, but the cost of these 26 days of engagement and the money needed to move almost half of our military, 5,000 to 10,000 miles, in order to effect the massive invasion was likely in the tens, if not more, billions of taxpayer dollars. The defense contractors grew in size, continued to grow each year after that. The Iraq shock and awe war was most certainly good for that segment of our society. Now it's 2024. And we're once again involved in trying to defeat the Iraqi nation, who has now joined forces with a militant group calling themselves Hamas. The Hamas military presence in Iraq is largely a byproduct of our tracking down, capturing in 2003, and killing Saddam Hussein, hanged in 2006 by an Iraqi court for crimes against humanity. His troops, the elite guard that Hussein assembled and trained and led, financed using American foreign aid dollars, were officially disbanded in 2003 after the American shock and awe military invasion of Iraq, but soon after resurfaced under new leadership as Hamas, who was originally located in both the West Bank and Gaza. Now Hamas, like Saddam Hussein, is fixated on driving Israelis out of the Middle East. Hamas emerged to fill the leadership gap when Hamas ran the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, headed by Yasser Arafat, out of Gaza, the small country that the PLO had been using as their base of operations. Hamas took over the small Palestinian country of Gaza by force and has been operating out of both Gaza and Iraq ever since. Now, Hamas claims to represent all Palestinians, but that is a big exaggeration. As this is being written, as I was writing it, in April of 2024, Hamas is attacking Israel by launching attacks from Gaza and Iraq on both Israel and some Palestinian citizens too. Israeli and some Palestinian in both Gaza and Israel. Israel is attempting to destroy Hamas by killing mostly innocent Palestinian citizens in Gaza. Hamas has mostly retreated to Iraq, and America is now sending relief supplies to the citizens of Gaza, both Palestinians and Israelis alike, while at the same time sending foreign aid in the way of military supplies to Israel so that they can continue bombing Gaza, and has now begun threatening Iraq and any Arab state that sides with Iraq once more. Our intelligence department's actions attempting to keep people fighting one another in the Middle East is going well, especially for our defense contractors. And rounding things out, we're once again fighting communism in the Ukraine, where we've already spent hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars in just over 1 year. And this war is just getting started. Things should be looking up for our economy any day now. In both instances, wars in the Middle East and the war in the Ukraine, the most likely real reason for fighting the war is to allow our commercial interests to have access to the production and distribution of precious minerals, commodities in these regions. Afghanistan is said to have some of the largest known deposits of precious metals, gold, copper, lithium, and some rare earth minerals in the world. And Ukrainian and Iraqi oil and rare earth minerals are also looked on with envy by developers of these commodities worldwide. So war has been and remains good for the businesses of some of our non-directly defense-related commercial interests too. Symptom 27. That's the last one, guys. Politicians arguing endlessly over who gets to dictate one-size-fits-all religious and morality issues like whether or when a woman can abort a pregnancy. And if so, whether either or both the mother and her father should be sterilized to avoid possible future unwanted pregnancies. This symptom of a society in decline also has some, but perhaps not major, implications relating to growth in population in America. Every unwanted child that's brought into the world is born with 2 strikes against him or her. A majority survive to become productive adults, but a significant minority do not. Which way it turns out, often, much too often, revolves around money. Too often these children end up becoming wards of the state and must be raised at taxpayer expense, so population may well be adversely affected when and if this happens. But decisions like this one can only properly be made by one person. Well, here we are at the end of connecting the links between problem number 1 on our list, excessive growth in population, and its impacts on each of the 27 symptoms it has helped spawn and made bigger in the past, and which it continues to make bigger each year going forward. Whenever you're ready to take a look at how problem number 2, systematic devaluation of human labor, also impacts each of these 27 symptoms of a society in decline, go to video number 4, the America 2 video series. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching and listening, and thanks for caring about our country and wanting to make America and us be all we can be together.